book is called Johnny Appleseed. It's a tall tale retold and illustrated by Stephen Kellogg. A tall tale. What parts of this story are unbelievable or exaggerated? When you find one, I want you to stop and jot. Johnny Appleseed, retold and illustrated by Stephen Kellogg. Johnny Appleseed. I see him with a wolf, a tin pot on his head, and a raccoon. Already I'm kind of wondering, is that true? Could he have worn a pot on his head and had a wolf as a pet and a raccoon as a pet? I don't know. Let's find out. John Chapman, who later became known as Johnny Appleseed, was born on September 26, 1774, when the apples on the trees surrounding his home in Leominster, Massachusetts, were as red as the autumn leaves. John's first years were hard. His father left the family to fight in the Revolutionary War, and his mother and baby brother both died before his second birthday. By the time John turned 6, his father had remarried and settled in Longmeadow, Massachusetts. Within a decade, their little house was overflowing with 10 more children. A decade is 10 years, so that's 10 children in 10 years. That is a lot of children. Nearby was an apple orchard. Like most early American families, the Chapmans picked their apples in the fall, stored them in the cellar for winter eating, and used them to make sauces, cider, vinegar, and apple butter. John loved to watch the spring blossoms slowly turn into the glowing fruit of autumn. Watching the apples grow inspired in John a love of all of nature. He often escaped from his boisterous or loud and busy household to the tranquil, which means calm, woods. The animals sensed his gentleness and trusted him. As soon as John was old enough to leave home, he set out to explore the vast wilderness to the west. Vast means huge. When he reached the Allegheny Mountains, he cleared a plot of land and planted a small orchard with the pouch of apple seeds that he had carried with him. That shows us Johnny Appleseed's country. So look, here's New York, that's us. This is about where we live in Westchester. Up here is Massachusetts, and this is where he was born, and this is where he grew up. And now he went over the Allegheny Mountains, and he's now going west, west to Pennsylvania. So that's where the story is now. John walked hundreds of miles through the Pennsylvania forest, living like the Indians that he befriended on the trail. As he traveled, he cleared the land for many more orchards. He was sure the pioneer families would be arriving before long, and he looked forward to supplying them with apple trees. Now, boys and girls, you studied the Native Americans. How did they live? Okay, so I want you to think about that. It says here that he lived like they did. So I want you to think to yourself and make a connection. How did Johnny Appleseed and the Native Americans live? When a storm struck, he found shelter in a hollow log or built a lean-to. On clear nights, he stretched out over the stars. Rather, he stretched out under the stars. Over the next few years, John continued to visit and care for his new orchards. The winters slowed him down, but he survived happily on a diet of butternuts. So a walnut grows on a tree and it falls down, and they are also called butternuts. One spring, he met a band of men who boasted that they could lick their weight in wildcats. They were amazed to hear that John wouldn't hurt an animal and had no use for a gun. Lick their weight. Do you think that means they're actually licking with their tongue a bunch of wildcats? No, of course not. It's figurative language. It means that they could beat up or kill. The band of men, they, challenged John to compete at wrestling, the favorite frontier sport. He suggested a more practical contest, a tree chopping match. The woodsman eagerly agreed. Now remember, boys and girls, the focus question is exaggerated. What is making this a tall tale? Has anything happened so far that could qualify this as a tall tale? When the sawdust settled, there was no question about who had come out on top. Again, this is figurative language, so that means who had come out on top means who won the contest. Well, look at the picture. Who's standing tall and proud? That's right, Johnny Appleseed. John was pleased that the land for his largest orchard had been cleared so quickly. He thanked the exhausted or tired woodsmen for their help, and he began planting. During the next few years, John continued to move westward. Whenever he ran out of apple seeds, he hiked to the eastern cider presses to replenish or renew his supply. Before long, John's plantings were spread across the state of Ohio. So I'm going to look back to my map. Remember, he started up here in Massachusetts. He went west to Pennsylvania. Now they're telling me that he went all the way to Ohio, so he keeps on going west. Meanwhile, the pioneer families were arriving in search of home sites and farmland. John had located his orchards on the routes that he thought that they'd be traveling. As he had hoped, the settlers were eager to buy his young trees. John went out of his way to lend a helping hand to his new neighbors. Often he would give his trees away. People affectionately called him Johnny Appleseed, and he began using that name. He particularly enjoyed entertaining children with tales of his wilderness adventures and stories from the Bible. In 1812, the British incited the Indians to join them in a war against the Americans. Incited means encouraged. The settlers feared that Ohio would become invaded from Lake Erie. It grieved, or it made Johnny sad, that his friends were fighting each other, his friends being the settlers and the Native Americans. But when he saw the smoke of burning cabins, he ran through the night, shouting a warning at every door. After the war, people urged Johnny to build a house and settle down. He replied that he lived like a king in his wilderness home, and he returned to the forest that he loved. During his long absences, folks enjoyed sharing their recollections or memories of Johnny. They retold his stories, and sometimes they even exaggerated them a little bit. Some recalled Johnny sleeping in a treetop hammock and chatting with the birds. That could be unbelievable or exaggerated. Others remembered that a rattlesnake had attacked his foot, but fortunately Johnny's feet were as tough as an elephant's hide, so the fangs didn't penetrate. It was said that Johnny had once tended or cared for a wounded wolf, and then kept him as a pet. An old hunter swore that he'd seen Johnny frolicking, which means playing, with a bear family. The storytellers outdid each other with tall tales about his feats of survival in the untamed wilderness. I want you to really pay attention to different parts of the page and think to yourself, what is a tall tale about Johnny Appleseed that you could tell by looking at this page? Why don't you look at this picture and see if there are any other tall tales that you could tell? Look, here's John Chapman doing something with apples in the ice. There he is with a cougar. I don't know what's happening there. This looks like almost like a monster. I don't know what's happening there. Look, oh my gosh, there's a tall tale you could tell about John Chapman, Johnny Appleseed, with an eagle. Here he is going over a huge waterfall. Look, there he is with some lightning striking a tree. My gosh, I wonder what a tall tale is that you could tell. As the years passed, Ohio became too crowded for Johnny. He moved to the wilds of Indiana, where he continued to clear land for his orchards. When the settlers began arriving, Johnny recognized some of the children who had listened to his stories. Now they had children of their own. It made Johnny's old heart glad when they welcomed him as a beloved friend and asked to hear his tales again. When Johnny passed 70 years old, it became difficult for him to keep up with his work. Then, in March of 1845, while trudging through a snowstorm near Fort Wayne, Indiana, he became ill for the first time in his life. Trudging means walking slowly and with difficulty. Johnny asked for shelter in a settler's cabin, and a few days later, he died there. Curiously, Johnny's stories continued to move westward without him. Folks maintained that they'd seen him in Illinois or that he'd greeted them in Missouri, Arkansas, or even Texas. Others were certain that he'd planted trees on the top of the slopes of the Rocky Mountains or in California's distant valleys. Even today, people still claim that they've seen Johnny Appleseed. Well, boys and girls, I hope you enjoyed our story time about Johnny Appleseed, the tall tale of Johnny Appleseed. Just to recap, to retell the story, first, John Chapman was born in Massachusetts. His dad went off to fight in the Revolutionary War, and unfortunately, his mom and his little brother died. So when his dad came back, he remarried, and they had 10 children. Then, when John was old enough, he left home. He walked to Pennsylvania, and he planted some apple orchards. Johnny was friendly with nature and friendly with Native Americans, and he did love nature, and wherever he went, he was a helper, and he helped the people around him. Whenever Johnny ran out of apple seeds, he'd travel west and find more seeds and plant more apple trees. Everybody started calling him Johnny Appleseed because they were very fond of him, which means that they really liked him. He never wanted to settle down. He preferred living in what he called his wilderness home. Over the years, people told stories about John Chapman, and some of those stories were exaggerated. He died when he was 70 years old, and his legend still lives on. What parts of this story are exaggerated or unbelievable? I hope that you liked our story, and I cannot wait to read to you again. Bye.